I am freezing. Ladies and gentlemen, it's pretty cold today, so welcome back to the warmth of my channel. Now that's a sentence I never want to repeat again in my entire life. That being said, my name is Viktor Vee, and if you're here then you've probably seen my music theory speedrun video that I've done and decided that a bird's eye view of things is not good enough for you. Good. Music is a language in of itself, and it can get a little confusing at times, but I will try to keep things as simple as I can. Contrary to that speedrun video, these types of videos are not meant to get you up and running as fast as possible. They are here to dig a little deeper for those curious and eager to level up their music production. So far, I have 18 music theory related topics to talk about. I'm not going to unload them all at once, don't worry about it. I'm going to make it a weekly thing, let's say on Monday. Music Theory Mondays sounds pretty good. And there's also text versions of everything on viktorvee.com. If you get confused about anything, that website is the absolute best way to look for answers and a progression path. And Patreon is the best way to support me if you'd like to throw a coin to your music witcher. You should also subscribe as to not miss any of these videos. Also, come and say hi in the comments. Come on. Alright, let's start. The most basic building block of music theory, one we will never get rid of, is the discussion about intervals. Intervals are distances between individual notes. Modern music uses what's called a 12-tone equal temperament, meaning we take an octave, which is the distance between one musical pitch and another with double its frequency, and we divide that into 12 separate intervals, equally spaced one from another. Yes, that's why we have 12 notes in an octave. Then we use letters to describe these notes. White notes are labeled from A to G. After that, they just repeat all over again. Then, black notes are labeled in relation to what white note they are adjacent to. You're going to hear the word enharmonic thrown around a lot. It's a fancy term to label a note that can have two names. It's usually used in relation to aforementioned black notes. I mean, makes sense considering they're named after the white note they are close to, and there's always one to the left and always one to the right. We use the term sharp to say that a black note is above the one on the left, or the term flat to describe it being lower than the one on the right. So this note, for example, can be described as either a G flat or an F sharp. Interval-wise, this smallest step from one note to another is called a half step, or a semitone. And if we have a half step, it makes sense that we also have a whole step, or whole tone, which is comprised of two half steps just put together. So a half step is the note right above or below the current one, and a whole step is one note over. C to C sharp is a half step, C to D is a whole step. Easy. A small detour. In case you haven't seen the music theory speedrun, yes, in Western music we only have 12 notes to play with, despite the piano having a lot more than that. What's happening there is that any type of playable keyboard has the same sequence of 12 notes being repeated over and over, going from low-sounding ones on the left to high and bright-sounding ones on the right. This, for example, is always the C note, just in different octaves. You can differentiate between octaves by the pattern of black notes. If we want to consider a C to be a start of our octave, there's always going to be that sequence of two black notes followed by three black notes, over and over. And this sequence of two followed by three is a great visual indicator to find your way around the keyboard pretty fast. So, we have 12 notes at our disposal to dance around, but usually we don't even use all 12. Usually we limit ourselves even further to specific scales or selections of notes that have a certain flavor to them. But we're not here to talk about scales just yet, we will talk about them next Monday we see each other. This was just to introduce the concept of us having several things to keep track of in our heads, so we cannot simply say, use note 8 of 12 whenever writing a melody. We need a better way to express that. That better way is what we're going to discuss next. The most common intervals you're going to come into contact with are major, minor, and perfect. But that's not all. Augmented and diminished intervals exist as well. They're slightly less common, but we do still need to talk about them. Now, it is extremely weird to talk about intervals without the context surrounding them. After all, we only see them in context being employed in scales, chords, and writing overall, but I will still push for this video and article and subsequent ones as well to be talking about them in this vacuum of space, this void with nothing surrounding them. And it's pretty much a coin flip on whether it's better or worse as a learning tool, but I personally prefer to learn things in isolation and later just click everything together, and that's how I'm going to teach you, because that's what I know best. So, major intervals coming up first. Major intervals apply to the distances of seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. What this means is that if you wanted to find, say, a major third from C, you take the C major scale and you look at its third note. Yes, it's as simple as that. A major second from C then is the second note in the C major scale, and you can fill the other blanks yourself. The major name comes from these intervals sounding pretty bright and happy. But if you don't have a scale on hand, another way of thinking about intervals is by using half steps and whole steps to calculate that distance. It's completely up to you what to use. A major second, for example, will be at the distance of 2 half steps or 1 whole step from the starting point. A major third will be at the distance of 4 half steps or 2 whole steps from where you start. A major sixth is 9 half steps or 4.5 whole steps. And major seventh is 11 half steps or 5.5 whole steps from your starting point. Of course, counting 11 or 9 half steps is not always a viable option. It sounds ridiculous. It takes way too long. But don't worry about it too much. With enough practice, you will be able to just fly around the keyboard. It's normal for things to take some time when you don't know them just yet. Okay, minor intervals are up next. They are very closely related to their major counterparts. In fact, there's only a half step difference between them. They share the same rules of existence. They can only be in seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths as well. Be careful though. While you can figure major intervals out by looking at the major scale and its note positions, that's not exactly true for the minor scale, because minor second will be off. But again, don't worry too much about it. A minor second is just the closest interval in music. It's a half step from the note you start on. In fact, forget even looking at scales now. Here's a cheat code. Be really good at figuring out major intervals. A minor interval is just a half step below the major one. So if a major third, for example, is 4 half steps away from a root, a minor is 3 steps away from the root. A root is the note we start on. But again, let's spell it out. A minor second will be at the distance of 1 half step or half whole steps. A minor third will be at the distance of 3 half steps or 1.5 whole steps. A minor sixth will be at the distance of 8 half steps or 4 whole steps. And minor seventh is 10 half steps or 5 whole steps. Alright, let's move on. Next up, perfect intervals. Perfect intervals are cool. You're going to be using them a lot, especially in chords. They sound really, really strong, and a lot of our note interaction is built around these perfect intervals. They exist in distances of unison, meaning no distance at all. Okay, it's the same note. Fourths, fifths, and octave, which is the same note at the double or a half the frequency. So, let's get to spelling. A unison will be at the distance of 0 half steps or 0 whole steps. It's the same note you start on. A perfect fourth will be at the distance of 5 half steps or 2.5 whole steps. A perfect fifth will be at the distance of 7 half steps or 3.5 whole steps. And an octave will be at the distance of 12 half steps or 6 whole steps. It's the same note at twice or half the frequency. Alrighty, time to reach for some slightly more odd intervals. So if an interval is spelled C to E flat, it's a minor third, right? Well, that's correct, but what if it's spelled C to D sharp? It's still the same note, but writing it as a minor third is slightly more weird, since you have a sharp sign in there. C to D is a second, so it should be some sort of a second then. The correct term for that is an augmented second. An augmented interval is an interval that's larger than a major or a perfect interval by a half step. Since it is derived from major and perfect intervals, it can only be applied to those distances. This means that we can have an augmented second, augmented third, augmented fourth, augmented fifth, and augmented sixth. An augmented 7 exists, but that's just a perfect octave, and misnaming is not commonly used. You can use the name of an augmented 7th, and sometimes you will see it in the wild, but that's usually to convey the direction you're going in, like in melodies. Still, pretty uncommon. And to dispel any confusion that might have arisen from a previous example, yes. A minor third and augmented second are the same note. There are different ways to spell notes depending on the context that are placed in. You will not find it super often, but that name and difference is really handy to know when you're going to encounter some more advanced music theory stuff, so you might as well just get used to it already from the get-go. Diminished intervals are the flip side of the augmented ones. It's an interval that's been made smaller than a minor or a perfect by a half step. This means we can have a diminished third, diminished fourth, diminished fifth, diminished sixth, and diminished seventh. There is no diminished second here, because that's simply unison. It's the same note you start on. And that's pretty much it for classifications. Now, this information purely by itself is not very useful, and that's absolutely fine, because everything will click later down the line whenever we're talking about scales, chords, progressions, and other cool stuff like that. So I still do advise you to practice your intervals and try to figure out what a diminished fourth is, for example, starting on different notes. The more practice you get now, the less work you're gonna have to do later down the line. But wait, the video's not over. There's still some cool stuff to talk about. An interesting piece of trivia is that an interval of a diminished fifth, or augmented fourth, is also called a tritone. This is also known as the devil's interval. Two intervals 3 whole tones apart sound extremely dissonant, and there are stories of singers and composers being excommunicated by the church if they were to use it during the late Middle Ages because of how wrong the interval sounded. But all of that is likely just made up and banter material. You will not get burned on a stake for using it, but it will likely throw the listener off, which means it's a useful tool in the right hands. And the last thing to talk about is inversions. C2G is a perfect fifth going up, we established that much. But what about going down? Going down the distance in intervals makes it a perfect fourth. A fifth when flipped around is not a fifth anymore, because the keyboard is not symmetrical. So when you name an interval, it's required to specify whether you're ascending or descending. To help us convert those intervals, we can use the rule of 9. The rule of 9 is: when any interval is inverted, the sum of ascending and descending intervals must be equal to 9. C2G is a fifth, so the inversion must be 9 minus 5 equals 4. It's a fourth. The inversion of a third is 9 minus 3 equals 6. Be careful. At the same time, the interval changes its quality. If it was major, it becomes minor. If it was minor, it becomes major. And if it was perfect, it stays perfect, just like you. And that's pretty much it for intervals. Take some time to practice. Like, for example, what's the relationship between C and B? B and F? F sharp and D flat. Just spend some time on it. Just have fun. Don't jump straight into the next video. Give it some time to metabolize and internalize it. Now go grab a cookie or something, and I'll see you in the next one. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can see the tag on screen right now, and the link is in the description below. You can also come and say hi on my Instagram. That's where I respond to your messages, and we'll be doing Q&As when more of you are around. So my name is Viktor Vee, and I am out.